he basically argued that by using educational system and by giving economic aid and reform to the people that are most in poverty situations, we can basically eliminate that poverty as a whole. Now, his Great Society program stretched beyond just dealing with poverty, but within his Great Society programs, he will create several different programs, including educational programs, which not only changed how we were educating both at the primary and the secondary level, but also created Head Start in 1965. He argued that basically, if we were to look at poor and minority children, they enter into the school system, public school system, already at a disadvantage to white and wealthier children. Because white children, their parents have a less likely to have a two-parent household that are working, at least in 1965, right? And as a result of not having both parents out in the workforce working, you would have a greater pre-kindergarten education from those parents, because those parents would be reading to their children and teaching them their colors and how to count and how to say the alphabet and all those little things. But it basically becomes almost a precursor to success, because then those children that don't have that, children who live in poverty and minorities who are also predominantly in poverty, they start out kindergarten already behind the white majority, okay? So he had to fix that, and Head Start still exists with us today. He also, along the lines of education, he pushes for greater reform and greater training within looking greater towards math and science. In addition to that, when it comes to kind of more jobs and his war on poverty, he will create numerous different programs to deal with the war on poverty. He passes food stamps, and we get the implementation of food stamps. In addition to that, he'll create the Child Nutrition Act, which largely deals with school lunch programs. So if you don't like your school lunch, you could, yes, take it all the way back and find Johnson. But you guys have so much greater selection than we ever had. We used to have this thing in school, like literally you went through and you had one line and you got whatever they fed you, right? But they had this thing that they would feed us on occasion. It was called a Manhattan roll. Let me tell you, I don't know if you know the Manhattan roll, but the Manhattan roll is like literally the most disgusting thing ever. It's like this weird like cinnamon rolly biscuit thing, except for it's not a cinnamon roll. Instead of having cinnamon or anything nice and yummy inside of it, it has like pieces of like dried beef inside of it.
Ew.
And then if that wasn't bad enough, then they take it and then they slather it with this gross weird cheese sauce that's like homemade macaroni and cheese sauce, really cheap cheese sauce. Like no, it does not look like that. It looks like a decent rendition of maybe what this Manhattan roll thing is. Believe me, it does not look like that. Anyways, so don't complain about your lunches. But he also then believes that we've got to provide greater health care for the poor, so we see the establishment of Medicare and Medicaid underneath those programs. We'll also see him create greater reform in civil rights legislation, as well as within job training. He'll create both Job Corps to do what this Peace Corps does under Kennedy, but do it on a domestic level rather than on an international level like Peace Corps was created to do. And also we'll see VISTA, which was specifically organized for youth volunteers in low-income, economically depressed areas such as the Appalachian Mountains. So when we look at his Great Society programs, they are numerous in their scope. Okay. We also see he'll create the HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, the EEOC, VISTA within civil rights. Of course, we have the Civil Rights Act of 64, the Voting Rights Act of 65, the Executive Order, which creates affirmative action, the Civil Rights Act of 1968. We'll see the passage of the 24th Amendment at the end of his term, the beginning of Nixon's term. Under the environment, we'll see the passage of the Water Quality Act and the Air Quality Act. He will change immigration, removing the quota system that existed since the 1920s. And he'll also create the endowment, National Endowment for the Arts and Humanities, which largely creates our art education system in the United States. So those of you that like art or like music, thank Johnson, okay? Because that's because of him, okay? So I know a lot of you are art or music kiddos, so you can thank Johnson for all that. Now, his #1 goal in creating the Great Society was to end poverty. And so when we look at that, the number of Americans living in poverty between the 60s and the early 70s does decrease dramatically. In fact, it's cut by over half. But many Americans fear that tax dollars that are being spent on the poor, and so the Great Society programs are largely criticized. But his Great Society programs largely come to an end or are not nearly as successful as they could have been because so much of the funding that should have been going to the Great Society programs were being diverted and being spent on the Vietnam War. Other programs also that aren't a part of his Great Society but are programs that Johnson pushes for to see change within the United States included he gets change and creates more mass transit. And as a result of the works of Ralph Nader, does anybody recognize that name?
Yeah.
He ran for president like a bazillion times under the Green Party, and he never, obviously hasn't ever won and hasn't really gotten that many votes ever, but he's run for a lot. But anyways, he writes this book called Unsafe at Any Speed, and it talks about the dangers of our national highway system and the dangers of being able to travel on the interstates at any speed or at any pace. But basically what it leads to is it leads to the development of speed limits on our highway systems, and it also leads to the development of seat belts and the requirement of seat belts in cars, both a lap belt and eventually then also a shoulder belt as well to make sure you don't die in a car accident.
So before that, there was no speed limit on the highway?
Some states, well, there is now, but like Montana, for a long time didn't have a speed limit at all either.
Why can't we still live in that society?
Because people are stupid.
There's no way.
I'm serious, I just heard a report, I think it was on NPR when I was on my way home, or maybe it was one of the other radio stations or something else like that. But a cop up in Duluth, he was going from Duluth north, just had to pull a guy over because he was going 170 miles per hour.
Yeah, I saw that.
He had to go over 130 miles per hour, the police officer did, just to catch up to the guy so the guy could see his lights. That's why we have...
See, but if he's not crashing at 170 miles an hour.
If you're going 170 miles per hour, there is no way that you can react to anything that occurs. So somebody pulls out in front of you, a deer runs out in front of you, a kid runs out in front of you.
That's over double the speed limit, right?
Way more than that, because I believe the speed limit on that road is maybe 60 or 65 at the most.
Yeah.
So it's closer to triple the speed limit. No, but he will lose his license. But it is reckless endangerment. It's not just about him, it's actually reckless endangerment. And he could be charged with more than just, a traffic violation.
I want to figure out what his traffic violation would be, though. That's my goal.
They don't actually have to take his license away. It's just up for.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But they probably do.
I mean, I would imagine that.
No, he's a good guy. His wife was pregnant.
Either way, it's bad. He's also heavily influenced by Rachel Carlson's Silent Spring and will then push for greater environmental reform as a result of that. But when we look at this and we look at it from the nuts and bolts standpoint, it does work. The goal was to reduce or eliminate poverty in the United States, especially amongst the hardest hit groups in poverty, especially the African American community. And when you look at that, it dramatically reduces the level of individuals living in poverty. Okay? Although it does increase federal spending on those social programs, as a result of these programs, including as a result of Head Start, we will see that the number of African Americans that are completing high school, 4 years of high school, increases dramatically. So does the percentage of African Americans who are able to complete 4 years of college or more also will increase. Not nearly as dramatically as that in high school, but it does increase. And just merely by graduating from high school, you open up the job opportunities for yourself in a much more dramatic fashion. Much more dramatic fashion then than now, but still it does open up those opportunities for you. So his Great Society programs, I would have to argue, are a success. Unfortunately for Johnson, he is not applauded for his work in the Great Society programs. Rather, he is looked at as being a failure because of the continuing problems in Vietnam and largely because of the Tet Offensive. So in the 1968 presidential election, he says that I will not seek my party's nomination, the Democratic Party's nomination for presidency. He could have run in the 1968 election because he's got 4 years and 4 years all combined that would have put him at 9 years. He can only serve 10 years. Okay? He can only serve 10 as per the 24th Amendment, but he doesn't seek his party's nomination. So instead, the Democratic Party nominates Humphrey, largely because of the fact that Robert Kennedy is assassinated shortly after winning the California primary, okay, by Sirhan. The other candidate that is nominated is George Wallace. Remember, George Wallace out of Alabama says,
Segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever.
Good job. Okay.
Can you
Wallace
imagine
is
if a
also a
president
kind of a
who said
crazy
that?
dude. Beyond the whole segregation thing, he literally basically said that he would shoot any hippie that stood in his way. So, yeah, I mean, he doesn't get a whole lot of votes, but he does get some of the popular vote, but not a whole lot. What you need to understand, though, is that Nixon's win is a very, very narrow win. In fact, he only gets not even 1 full % of the popular vote more than what Humphrey gets. Now, he's able to secure more of the electoral vote, largely because he'll take home larger states, such as Ohio and California is his home state. And since he's able to take that, Nixon will win the 1968 election. However, Nixon will use this, and he looks at this closeness, and it will largely affect when he goes to run for re-election in 1972, okay? Which ultimately will lead us to Watergate. Now, it is in Nixon's presidency then that largely because of the policies of Johnson's administration through the Great Society programs, but also largely because of the Vietnam War, that the United States enters this period what he calls stagflation. And basically what that is you have really, really high inflation. At the same time, you have economic stagflation. So the economy is not really growing and or shrinking. There's unemployment, and as a result, you'll see an economic recession. So Nixon, maybe not learning so well from history, decides that the best way to combat this is to put a tax on imports, specifically to put a tax on oil. Now, part of that is twofold. One, it's not only, the idea was it would help protect American industry, but also the idea in it was that it would actually hurt OPEC, which OPEC, under control of numerous Middle Eastern states, but specifically at this point, Egypt and Syria in 1973 are at war with Israel, and the United States is an ally of Israel. So he felt like it would hurt. It would help Israel, and it would hurt Egypt and Syria, right? So, yay, let's put an embargo on, or an high import on oil. The problem with that is it causes gas prices in the United States to increase dramatically. Now, not by any means what we would think it would be increased dramatically, but at the time it was increased dramatically. Because you have to understand that minimum wage in the United States is $1.25 an hour. So, when gas prices rise in some cases to $1 an hour, that's a lot, right? That's a huge portion of your income that is going towards paying just for gas alone. In addition to that, you have to realize that cars during this time frame are not getting 30, 40 miles a gallon like some of our cars today. They're getting like 13, 14, maybe if you're lucky, 15 miles a gallon. And that doesn't matter, and that's like highway mileage, right? So they're not doing very well on the miles a gallon. They're big, huge, heavy clunker, not really clunker, but heavy, made of steel muscle cars. So they weigh a lot and they aren't very fuel efficient. Now, he does try to institute wage controls and price controls, and he takes the United States off of the gold standard. These two things were both things that FDR did during the course of World War II, and they are largely successful. This is something, though, that is done by numerous presidents over the years to try to protect American industry. Has it ever worked? No. It only causes further problems. So, again, probably not the best of ideas there, Nixon. He begins then his domestic programs, which he calls New Federalism. Okay? And the idea behind, or there's kind of a joke that he was a Democratic president. He's not a Democrat, he's a Republican. But largely because we see in there that there are a lot of tax benefits for poor, and there's a lot of social programs for that. He actually increases revenue sharing between the federal government and the state governments as well, but he also asks the state governments to assume greater responsibility for taking care of their citizens. He also, in 1972, he will ask for an additional $30 billion for Congress to fund his new federalism programs, and as a result of that as well, he also calls to ensure that every family in America had a minimum income. He calls it FAP, Family Assistance Program, or plan, and basically what this was designed to do was to ensure that every American got an annual income of at least $1,600 a year. But it largely fails because of the fact that he doesn't get a lot of backing from the Republican-dominated Congress. And individuals like Patrick Moynihan argue against it, saying it's basic socialism. In addition to that, though, his new federalism programs called for a tax benefit for those individuals who use daycare, which makes sense and still exists to this day, by the way. You get a tax break for daycare. He also will increase funding to Medicare and Medicaid. He calls for rent subsidies. He calls for Social Security benefits to be increased, so the amount that you got would keep pace with the inflation going on. And he also, though at the same time, we'll see him spend about 50% more in non-defense programs than what we had seen under the Johnson administration. And as a result, the number of people living below the poverty lines continue to increase. Now, under Nixon's presidency, he has the opportunity to appoint 4 of the 9 Supreme Court Chief Justices because the others either die, resign, or retired. Now, not to be confused with Justice Earl Warren, Chief Justice Warren Burger, 2 different people, okay? So it's not like I'm trying to combine 2 names here and call them like Warren Burger. No, it's Earl Warren and Warren Burger. Okay, does that make sense? I know sometimes it's confusing because they're literally one right after another, right? And it's like, wait, Warren Burger, what? Okay, all right, but it's 2 different dudes. But he gets appointed as the Chief Justice. He's pretty well moderate, but a lot of his other appointees are not. In fact, 2 of them actually get denied and rejected by the Senate because of the fact that they have a very strong racial bias. In fact, Nixon himself does not support the civil rights movement at all. Which largely cost him the Southern voters because so much of them are predominantly African American. He basically believed that they were black militants, and so he actually begins programs that slow down the integration of schools, and we see that integration is then completely denied in some cases or delayed in others. Okay? Under the Burger administration, though, Burger, who's a Minnesotan, by the way, he is actually more conservative than Justice Earl Warren was, but still a little bit more to the moderate side. When we see this, he will have several landmark legislations that come out of his time as Supreme Court Chief Justice. We'll see in 1971 the Supreme Court will order busing to integrate the schools. In addition, in 72, we will see it make it more difficult to actually convict somebody of a capital crime, which would involve the death penalty, and also outlined certain punishments for the death penalty as cruel and unusual. This included using the firing squad and hanging, although some states still retain the right to allow a person to choose their method of execution. And most recently, I believe it was in Utah, a dude tried to get executed by firing squad, and the Supreme Court actually denied him that right to choose death by firing squad.
Wow.
I don't know why you would want that, but that's what he wanted, and so Utah was like, then here's what we want. But the Supreme Court said no, it's cruel and unusual.
Well, that's what you want.
Probably the most controversial and the most landmark of the Burger, the two most landmark cases out of the Burger Court is first Roe v. Wade, which made it illegal for a state to prevent a woman from having an abortion on the right to her privacy. That the woman's right to privacy surpassed the right of the fetus to life because the child is not viable, so therefore it is not a child. But as a result of that, it will spawn the right to life movement and arguably has spawned our current controversy that we are in our society today, which again our Supreme Court will have to decide on whether or not states can limit a woman's right to an abortion or not. And as of yet, it has yet to be decided by the Supreme Court. In addition to that, we'll see the Voting Rights Act extended by them, and probably another big piece of legislation that comes also out of Minnesota is Title IX. There is a young swimmer from Minnesota, a female swimmer from Minnesota, who wants to, or is swimming on her high school team, but the only team that they have is a boys team, so she's been competing with the boys on her program in her school, and she's actually a pretty decent swimmer. They go to another school to compete, and that coach from the other school tells her she is not allowed to compete because she cannot compete with boys. It is a boys swim program, not a girls swim program, so therefore she is not allowed to compete. Well, her mother just happens to be an attorney, and she's not very happy about this whole, my daughter can't compete because she's a girl theory. And so she sues, and it goes all the way up to the Supreme Court, which gives us the decision that sets up Title IX, which makes it illegal to discriminate based on gender within schools, and makes it so now that there are equal funding and equal programs in both genders. Okay?
Minnesota people take a weird pride in Title IX, like they had some key thing to do with it.
Well, they did have a key thing to do with it, because...
Well, Joe Schmo from Moorhead didn't have a key thing to do with it.
Joe Schmo from Moorhead didn't. Minnesota did, but not some Joe Schmo. The girl, and I think if I remember right, she's down from somewhere in the cities, but I don't remember.
Talking about a sports team, like, we won last year, so
we
got the bill passed.
Nixon largely pushes on even greater environmental reform than we've seen under the Johnson administration, largely because of Rachel Carlson. He's heavily influenced by her Silent Spring and arguing that DDT threatened the bird populations, and that air pollution and atomic weapons testing would basically cause the downfall of our ecology, which would then prevent us from actually being able to raise crops, which would mean that Americans and everybody in the world would eventually starve to death. Okay? So as a result of that, we see that in environmental measures, we'll see the creation of Earth Day in 1970, the Environmental Protection Agency, the Resource Recovery Act, the Clean Air Act. In 72, we have Water Pollution Control Act and Pesticide Control Act, which makes DDT and other chemicals like it illegal. And lastly, we also have in 1973, the creation of the Endangered Species Act. So if you're an environmentalist, you can thank Mr. Richard Nixon for all of the environmental reform. Unfortunately for Richard Nixon, he largely doesn't go down as being actually a fairly decent president. He's not a bad president. He just makes a very key, very poor choice. Okay? On top of which, we have Vietnam ending in Nixon's presidency. And so Nixon is largely blamed for the loss of Vietnam to communism. So people forget about all the environmental reform that he pushes through. People forget about the expansion of Medicare, Medicaid. People forget about the good things that Nixon does because they look at the bad things as overriding them. Now, Nixon becomes very, very suspicious early on of some of the secret nature of individuals within the White House and surrounding it and within the other political parties. So he begins to actually kind of create an enemies list in which he is very fearful of some individuals. And what he winds up doing is he creates kind of an organization, a secret intelligence unit nicknamed the Plumbers, to undertake kind of a presidential mission to investigate these quote-unquote enemies of the president. So within that, then, what we find out is that someone within the National Security Council actually leaks some information that lets the public know in the New York Times that Nixon had been doing some secret wiretapping of these so-called enemies of his. And unfortunately, that comes out at the exact same time, or right about this exact same time, as the leak of the Pentagon Papers. And so as a result of that, there's a lot of suspicion around Nixon as a president, and people aren't really 100% sure about that. But Nixon basically argues that, look, national security was threatened, and so therefore it was important for me to use these wiretaps. So to a certain extent, Nixon gets away with it a little bit initially. However, Nixon is now looking at re-election. In 1970, in the midterm election, the Republicans win by very narrow margins, and so they only have a very small majority in Congress. When it goes to the 1972 presidential election, then he's looking at the other candidates, and he's kind of fearful of who he's running up against. Now, George Wallace doesn't actually wind up really running because he is crippled by an assassin's bullet. And then his other, person he's going against is George McGovern out of South Dakota. Now, whether he would have actually been like a really strong candidate against Nixon is hard to really know. But Nixon is so fearful that he's going to lose the bid for the office of presidency in 1972 that in March of 1972 he creates a special committee. It's called the Committee to Re-elect the President. And they make plans to wiretap phones at the Democratic National Headquarters at Watergate apartment complex in Washington, D.C. Okay? Which, if you've ever seen Forrest Gump, when he calls in and he talks about the lights in the other building keeping him up at night.
Oh, yeah.
That's the Watergate break-in. Okay? But he's really fearful of that Democrats being victorious through that election. And so the first attempt to set up the wiretapping, he actually fails. In the second attempt to get the wiretapping set up, the men are arrested. 5 of them are arrested, including 2 of the leaders, Hunt and Liddy. Now, the money that they are paid to go in and set up the wiretapping is actually directly traced back to Nixon's campaign.
Nice.
So it's very clear that Nixon's campaign, at least, was directly responsible for the break-ins themselves. Now, what ensues then is the Watergate scandal. The break-in itself is not the scandal, it's what occurs after that's the scandal. Does that make sense? Okay. So, the Nixon administration begins denying any knowledge of the break-in or any knowledge of this plan whatsoever at all. They call it a third-rate burglary. They say it is completely unconnected to anybody in the White House and anybody within his direct control. So in other words, I had no control over these people. They did this on their own. I didn't know they were doing it. I had nothing to do with it. I am not a crook.
I'm not a crook.
Yeah. Privately, Nixon begins launching a cover-up campaign, which includes, here's the Watergate, okay, includes him ordering the CIA to misinform the FBI. We see Watergate defendants are bribed into silence. He has people coach them on what to say in court and basically to lie under oath, okay? In addition to that, we see, so as a result of that, from the backside politically, right, there's a whole lot going on leading up to the 1972 presidential election. However, the vast majority of the American public is not aware of all of this scandal that's going on within the White House, and so Nixon wins in a landslide victory. Remember, Americans are pretty trepid or nervous about changing their horse halfway through a river, right? We generally keep a president on. The only reason why Johnson is not reelected in '68 is because he chooses not to run for a reelection, right? He could have possibly been reelected, although it's hard to say because after Tet Offensive, his popularity rating, approval rating in the United States is like 20%. So it's hard to say if he would have been elected or not. But Nixon wins the 1972 election. At trial, the burglars are basically, they either plead guilty or they're sentenced and found guilty. And so as a result, the judge who is presiding over the trial, he is not convinced that we know the full story. So he begins to call for further investigation of the Watergate break-in to find out more of what actually occurred. And through that investigation, then led by Woodward and Bernstein, we find out that in fact that they believe that the White House was actually involved, and so they try to prove that. Now, in order for Nixon, to try to prove that he's innocent, he gets a special prosecutor for the Watergate affair, and he nominates a dude by the name of Archibald Cox. Well, Archibald Cox knows that Nixon has these White House tapes. Nixon, because he wanted to write a memoir and he wanted to write a book, he very early on had a recording device installed in the Oval Office so that it would record not only all phone conversations that he had, but all conversations he had, period, in the White House. So then he could go back and refer to them as he was writing his memoir. Bad idea, Richard Nixon, but that was his idea, was that then I can use them as I write my memoir, right? And it'll be perfect, because it's like historical document. It'll be awesome. Okay? But anyways, he actually orders Nixon to release the White House tapes, and Nixon subsequently fires him. Now, Nixon then goes to Attorney General Elliot Richards, and he tells Elliot Richards, you're going to take over for Cox. Richards says, no, I'm not doing that, because basically he believes the same thing that Cox does, that he should release the White House tapes. He basically is arguing, look, Nixon, if there's nothing on the White House tapes that are going to incriminate you, just release them to the Senate committee that is investigating you, and then it's not a problem. But he refuses to do that, and he then resigns, since he doesn't want to take that position, as well as his assistant also resigns. The assistant attorney general resigns because he believes the same thing that the other two dudes do. And so then lastly, finally, he gets the attorney, or the solicitor general, Robert Bork, and Robert Bork says, yeah, Nixon, you don't have to turn over the tapes. I'll fire Cox, it's cool. And so he complies. Nixon gets what he wants, and that's why it's called the Saturday Night Massacre, because a whole bunch of people basically get removed from office. But as a result of that, in the summer of '74, the committee of the House convenes to begin impeachment proceedings on Nixon. They vote on July 30th. The 7 Republicans join the Democratic majority to vote. I think it's like a vote of 15 to something over 3 articles of impeachment. Basically, did he obstruct justice? Was he abusing his power? And was he subverting the Constitution? Because those wiretaps and the break-in basically constitute an unreasonable search and seizure. Does that make sense? Okay? And his primary duty as President of the United States of America is to uphold the Constitution. When they take their oath of office, that is their primary responsibility, is to uphold the Constitution of the United States. His removal seems pretty likely. So given that in August 5th of '74, Nixon finally releases the tapes to the special committee that is investigating it. Unfortunately, there's an 18.5-minute gap in the tapes that mysteriously is no longer there, and it doesn't work. I don't know what happened to the tapes. They just magically stopped working at about 18 and a half minutes. They just don't work anymore. There's nothing there. And then they start up again. But there's nothing there that you would have known. It wasn't a big deal, really. It's not that big of a deal. And basically, what it reveals, even with that 18 and a half minutes gone, it reveals that Nixon, yes, in fact, was a part and knew about the Watergate break-in at the hotel. And in fact, he was actually involved in a cover-up as little as 6 days after the break-in occurred, that he began launching this cover-up scheme to prevent that knowledge from going forward. As a result of that, Congress will vote, and they decide that Nixon, you are going to be removed from office. Remember, the impeachment is just the proceedings, and once they decide and find him guilty, then they would remove him from office, right? So they find him guilty, he's basically going to be removed from office, and he has a choice now. You can quit, or
We can remove you.
get fired, right? So you can quit or get fired. Now, if you're President of the United States of America, I mean, quitting's pretty bad. To quit the office of the presidency, that's pretty bad. But to get fired?
There's more honor in being fired.
Yeah, you get severance.
Yeah. I don't know. But either way, it's a bad news bears for him either way. And on August 9th, he resigns, simply stating this: I hereby resign the office of the President of the United States. Sincerely, Richard Nixon.
What?
Why did?
That's it. Okay? Now,
But he signed with his left
because
hand,
of
so it's
normal
not official.
secession, who should become President of the United States?
Vice President.
His Vice President. There's a problem with Spiro Agnew, though, his Vice President. Spiro Agnew is in jail. He is no longer VP because of the fact that he was committing tax evasion, and he also was accepting bribes. And so as a result of that, he is in jail right now. So now we have to go to the Speaker of the House, who's the third in line for the position, and that becomes
Gerald Ford.
Gerald Ford, and so he becomes known as his ascendancy because he ascends into the office of the presidency, and he does not run for re-election in 1976, and so as a result of that, he's never elected into the position, the office of the presidency. He is the only person to never be elected as President of the United States, but yet to serve as President of the United States.
That's my goal.
Okay. In the aftermath of Vietnam, in the aftermath of Nixon's presidency, we do see some dramatic changes. 26th Amendment, of course, which we've talked about. The War Powers Resolution, which we've talked about as a result of the end of Vietnam. But also we see in 1974 the Freedom of Information Act, which tried to close the credibility gap between the government and the people. But still, even though you can ask for any piece of government information, when they release it to you, if they think anything in it is a needs of national security, they basically will just like black marker out large sections of it, and then you'll have like a huge long section, and it'll be like that you can actually read, and everything else is like blacked out. So. You know, it also leads to the Fair Campaign Practices Act of 1974, which was designed to limit campaign contributions and create stricter accountability for public financing of presidential campaigns. It was designed to limit the super PACs that we have today, but this has subsequently been removed, and now we have people like the Koch super PAC spending, like the Koch brothers spending billions, like trillions of dollars on campaigning, which...
Who are they campaigning for this year? For this election?
I'm not 100% positive on that one, to be honest.
Jeb Bush.
Yeah.
I feel like it was, actually.
It might have been Bush, but obviously Bush isn't in it anymore, so I don't know who they've put their money behind now. Or maybe they're just doing nobody specifically, but I'm going to anti somebody.
Anti.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, so it also creates in 1978 the Independent Counsel Act, which required the Attorney General to basically investigate any specific criminal or suspected criminal activity within the executive branch. So, and then he would have to create that special prosecutor to do it. But yet there's a credibility gap. Americans and Richard Nixon's presidency and the Vietnam War, believing that our government no longer has our best interest at heart and no longer is doing what is best for the American people, but rather what is best for few people or for those in political power. And that's the end of Nixon's presidency. Yeah. And he's no longer president. And Ford is president. Gerald Ford. And then we get Carter, the peanut farmer.
And then Reagan, and then
Reagan, Hollywood star.
and then Bush,
And then Bush.
and then Clinton, and then
And
Bush,
then
and
Clinton, and then
Obama,
Bush, and then Obama.
and then Trump.
And then,
No, please. Please.
I don't know.
Kanye.
And
No,
then Kennedy.
he's not old enough. No, after.
Yeah.
And then Kobe. Kobe for president. MVP.
Black Mamba.
MVP. Black
Okay, so
Mamba
I don't know what's
2016.
going like on or anything, but like I have heard like within school just walking around that there are a lot of students who were very riled up today about Black Lives Matter, da 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 da.
Really?
Yeah, and I
I
don't
did
know
not
if there was
hear about
something
that.
specific that happened last
I
night.
have not heard.
Yeah.
I didn't.
I haven't heard.
What? I don't know.
Yesterday was Mom Day.
Yesterday was Mamba Day.
Yesterday was Middle Child's Day, but everyone.
Oh,
No, it
okay.
was Mamba Day.
Today is National White People Day. So.
It was Kobe Bryant's final game of his career.
He scored
Black
60
Mamba.
points.
Scored 60 points.
Didn't you watch the game?
Oh, okay.
Is it like about
It's a good game.
What's
It
that?
was. I teared up.
I teared up.
Dude, I was like,
Oh, they're still recording. I can record you.